Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Well, friends, it's been a year. Can you believe it? Since our COVID lockdown went into full force? And the profound impact of the COVID health emergency and the subsequent economic fallout have affected virtually every element of our 21st century lives. And among infection rates, unemployment, housing shortages, and the loss of life, it's also evidenced in an area that has not gotten enough attention: lack of access to safe, affordable, accessible water. Water is vital to public health, and while the majority of American households served by water utilities receive a reliable supply of quality drinking water, the COVID-related economic crisis has left Californians a collective $1 billion behind on their water bills, a water debt with little ability to pay. In our pandemic present of 2021, ensuring safe water for all is an increasingly urgent public health and racial justice issue. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about water accessibility, affordability, and equity, and how, even if our state has already declared that its residents have a right to safe, affordable, and accessible drinking water, many Californians were confronting a water insecurity even before the pandemic got serious last spring, and it seems especially fragile now, with many in this state on the threshold of being evicted and homeless, not even able to pay their rent or mortgages or for their gas and electricity, much less for their water. Oh, and then also complicating California's water accessibility and supply issues is another chronic challenge for our state: the drought, which is being made worse by climate change. We'll also talk about legislative and community advocate efforts to provide financial assistance and protections to Californians who can't pay their water bills, and assistance and protection that would go a long way toward helping California's Water for All declaration become an actual reality. We're always proud to welcome back to Then There's California State Senator Bill Dodd, who represents the 3rd Senate District way up in the north part of the state, including Napa, Solano, Sonoma, and Yolo counties. He's the chair of the Senate Committee on Governmental Organization, and before being elected to the Senate, Bill Dodd served in the State Assembly and was, for 15 years prior, a member of the Napa County Board of Supervisors. The last time Senator Dodd appeared on this podcast was just about a year ago when he joined former California Department of Public Health Director Dr. Karen Smith to talk to us about COVID and health and safety issues as the pandemic started unfolding all around us. That time and conversation seemed like an eternity ago, but here we are in the late winter, early spring of 2021 with Senator Dodd in person. Good to actually see you in person. Welcome back, Senator Dodd.
Thank you very much, Brian. Great to be back.
How are you? How's your family, and how are all the good folks of the 3rd Senate District?
You know what? It's up and down. For my family, we've just been very, very blessed, very, very fortunate. For others, like you said in your opening remarks, it's been an uneven comeback, so to speak.
Yes.
But, I'm hopeful as we see the vaccines coming out, as we see people really taking the mask mandates in California more seriously. I look all the time when I'm driving around, and I've been very, very impressed. And what we have to do now is we need to just continue, wear the damn mask, 6 feet, wash your hands. By the way, there's a byproduct of that. Who's getting the common cold or the regular flu?
You're right. I haven't been sick in a year.
And normally in this germ pool across the street here at the state capitol, we get it once a month. So right. There are some benefits.
Thank you for letting us know the blessings and silver linings in the midst of all this. And joining Senator Dodd on this episode by phone to further edify and clarify for us the issues and policy dynamics surrounding water inequity and accessibility are 2 California-based advocates. First, Michael Claiborne, who is a directing attorney with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, a nonprofit organization that works alongside the most impacted communities in San Joaquin and eastern Coachella valleys to advocate for sound policy and eradicate injustice to secure equal access to opportunity. Michael Claiborne, welcome to Then There's California. How are you, sir?
Morning, Brian. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
Good. And also joining us by phone is Jonathan Nelson, who is a policy director for the Community Water Center, an environmental justice community-based organization that works to ensure all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. Jonathan Nelson, welcome to Then There's California.
Thanks for having me and for the opportunity to talk about such an important issue right now.
Glad to have you both. So, gentlemen, I share here your titles and a brief top-line description of the work that your respective organizations do. Let me take a moment just to get a little more detail about your organizations and the work that you proudly do for them. Michael, just give us a little more background about your title and the work your organization does.
Sure. Leadership Council is an environmental and social justice nonprofit. We're based in the San Joaquin Valley. We have offices in Fresno, Bakersfield, East Coachella, and I'm based in Sacramento. Work on a range of issues that are impacting communities in the San Joaquin and East Coachella valleys, largely communities of color. Issues that they're facing include lack of access to safe drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as issues like lack of access to quality, affordable housing, safe and clean transportation options, climate change, just a range of issues that impact communities' ability to live and thrive. So a lot of interesting work going on, and happy to be here to talk about drinking water.
Jonathan, same for you. Give us a little more detail about the work of the Community Water Center.
Sure. So the Community Water Center is a community-based organization that believes that access to safe and affordable drinking water is a basic human right and not a privilege, and that works to address the divide we have in California between those that have safe water and those that don't. We are headquartered in the southern San Joaquin Valley and also have offices on California's Central Coast and in Sacramento. We really believe that community voices, and particularly those most impacted by our state's drinking water crisis, need to have a seat at the table and make sure that their voice is heard as part of decisions that affect them and their families. And we've made some real progress in California since we were founded about 15 years ago. And we still have many challenges. And the topic that we're talking about today, water affordability, has really moved to the top of our to-do list. So we're looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Gentlemen, let's get into this discussion. I read recently that indigenous communities refer to water as a relative, reminding us that we are deeply connected to water, that we should treat it with respect and care as we would treat a member of our family. And Senator, in 2012, nearly a decade ago, the California legislature recognized a human right to safe, clean, affordable drinking water. But a declared right doesn't always mean a reality in terms of a right, correct?
You're absolutely right. When I got in the California State Assembly in 2015, one of the things in my tour around my district, I had Lake County in the 4th Assembly District, and I saw the little community of Lucerne, a lot of senior citizens on fixed incomes, Social Security, had water rates approaching $300 plus a month just for water. And it was really impacting their quality of life. And throughout the community, even small families, again, on fixed income, were having to sacrifice perhaps medications, perhaps any number of things because their water bill was so high. So I sought out right away to do, and I've had a series of bills in the Assembly and the California State Senate that seeks, first of all, to get information. Because without the appropriate information, you really can't do anything. And so first, the Water Resources has just done a great job so far in terms of defining the problem. And we know that problem. Later, I had a bill that would seek to set standards for water companies before they shut off somebody's water. Somebody's water to a family, perhaps with a young baby, senior citizens, again, on fixed incomes, or people that are medically fragile. We have to make sure that, as we do this, we do it well and we do it right. And this is an area that I have just continued to work on, and I feel very, very strongly that water affordability and that people's right to that water is maintained. Now, we all know that there's no free lunch, and these water bills have to be paid. But nevertheless, one of the other things I seek to do in my bill, SB 222, is to set up a fund that helps people. So while they can't make the payment, the water company still needs to be paid, or it's in, people are talking about violation of Prop 218, which sets forth standards that the rest of the community cannot pay for the problems of one other member of that community, in this case in a water district. But with this fund and establishing the fund that we have right now, we can receive federal funds into it, we can receive nonprofit, and later it's my hope that we start getting allocations from the state budget to put into this so that we can help. By extension, this not only helps individuals, but it helps water purveyors as well that are suffering from non-payment of bills.
That's true. I have read the statistics that a lot of water purveyors, water districts are ready to go under because of the debt that they have.
That's right. They have to continue to do the work that they need to provide the safe, affordable drinking water. So at the same time, I really believe this is going to be a benefit to both. But as you mentioned, and as you began the program, $1 billion. But this was a problem well before the pandemic. So we're at $1 billion now. Water rates up to 2015 had gone up 45% in many areas of the state of California, particularly in rural, disadvantaged communities.
Michael and Jonathan, I obviously want to talk about the details of the senator's bills, but just having you gentlemen focus on the initial Declaration of Rights that was declared a decade ago and where we are now with those alleged rights here in 2021.
Yeah, I can take that one. This is Michael. So I think it's absolutely critical that the state moved forward in 2012 by recognizing the human right to water. But the question that I get and I hear from community residents that we're working with in the San Joaquin and East Coachella Valleys is, what does this legal right mean to me, to my family, to my community? And in many cases, it hasn't meant enough. It hasn't meant that folks have access to safe water or affordable water. So there's a lot of progress that has been made in the last decade, but in places like Tullyville and Tulare County, Delhi and Merced County, Tombstone Territory, Oasis Mobile Home Park, many communities that we're working with, there just isn't access to safe and affordable water. So much more needs to be done. I would say in the last 10 years, things like SB 200 2 years ago, AB 401 that was authored by Senator Dodd that required the State Water Board to study how to develop a low-income rate assistance program and provide relief to folks struggling with high water bills and at risk of water shutoffs have been critical, and progress has been made, but there are still far too many Californians that lack access to safe and affordable water, and much more needs to be done. I think both of these bills authored by Senator Dodd this year are steps in the right direction and are really important. And
Jonathan, your comments.
Well, this may be a good segue to what we'll talk about more, I know, in just a minute, which is that this basic human right to water that we all have and that we've recognized as a state in California, which really shows, at least in that regard, our leadership on drinking water issues, is being threatened by what we're seeing with this pandemic. The gap between those that have safe water and those that don't is about to grow because of this water debt crisis, unless we do something about it proactively, which in part this legislation being put forward by Senator Dodd will do.
I had read, gentlemen, that even before the pandemic, California water was considered simultaneously too cheap and also too expensive. Senator, beginning with you, does that counterintuitive description make sense to you?
Well, look, we're a big state. We've got 40 million people, and we have affluent areas, and then we have other areas that are less fortunate. So, yes, I can see for some people, particularly people in really well-to-do areas that are using proportionately way more water, that probably they should be. But again, that's their right to access to that water. Probably should be paying more. So I think that's probably a fair assessment.
And Michael and Jonathan, your comments on the nexus between too cheap and too expensive when it comes to California water.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that really in the last 50 years, the federal government has stepped back in terms of investing in water systems. So a lot of small water systems in particular are struggling with infrastructure that really should have been replaced and updated years ago. And they can't afford to make those changes, to make those improvements to their water systems, because there really is a lack of support in terms of federal funding for infrastructure. So I think that's the too cheap part. In terms of too expensive, in a majority of water systems throughout the state, water rates are such that if you're at or near the poverty level, water is unaffordable. So that's something we really need to address. For low-income households throughout the state, access to affordable water is very limited. And as a result, folks have to make trade-offs between essentials like paying for water, paying for rent, paying for medicine. And that's really not where we should be at if we really believe, as I do, that access to water and affordable water is a human right.
We have talked about the reference to water debt. I had mentioned I'd called it a water insecurity, like a food insecurity or a housing insecurity. Senator or Jonathan and Michael, have you gentlemen ever faced any kind of water debt, any water insecurity in your life of any kind?
For my family growing up, we've never had to have that happen. And I think that could be important because, we all tend to take this for granted. And when you get in a position of public service and you go out to communities and you can see firsthand where people are frightened and people are crying and talking about how this is really impacting their life, it just pulls you in. And I think that's what pulled me into this policy. A lot of times policymakers latch on to something that's happened to them. Not so with me. I saw what this was doing to so many people throughout my district and throughout the state of California, and just thought this is an area I want to be involved in.
And Michael, I know you and your communities and your organization that you work with down in the Valley, I know you have seen it. I don't know about your own personal experiences, but talk also in further detail about the water debt and that water insecurity that you see in the communities that your organization serves.
Yeah, I'd say that personally, like the senator, I've been very fortunate and haven't faced water debt that I haven't been able to catch up to. And I think this is an important place to acknowledge that the impacts of water debt are not felt equally throughout the state. It is a statewide problem, but access to affordable water and unaffordable water shutoffs disproportionately impact communities and households of color. So I think that it's important to acknowledge this is really a racial justice and an environmental justice issue. We do work directly with communities and households that live every day with water insecurity. And what does that mean in communities? That means that they have to deal with the stress of water debt. It means that they're facing the risk of water shutoffs. And I've represented households that have lost access to drinking water because of water debt for extended periods of time. And it also means that when folks lose access to water, they can't do basic things like wash their hands, engage in basic sanitation, wash vegetables, cook. These are just not choices and experiences that people should have to face. And unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of families in California.
Jonathan Nelson with the Community Water Center, I'm sure your recollections and the work that you and your organization are doing on the ground echo what Michael has said, correct?
Absolutely. Although I'll say that this issue of shutoffs and utility debt has touched my family, and as well as issues around evictions and rent. And that's as recent as, the crisis we're in right now. So certainly with communities we work with, similar to Michael, there is real disproportionate pain. We know based on data, but also just our direct experience through the work that Michael and I have the privilege to do in communities of color around the state, including communities we work with in the Central Valley and Central Coast. And it's also important, again, to recognize that this issue of water affordability, while it's gotten worse during the pandemic, was a challenge even before. So we know, based on state water board data, which we have, by the way, thanks to the leadership of Senator Dodd and legislation that he had previously worked on, like SB 998 a couple of years ago, we now know that this issue of water shutoffs was pervasive before the pandemic. For example, we know that about 500,000 Californians were impacted by water shutoffs in 2019. So that was the quote unquote normal before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit and the water debt has just piled up. And we began hearing fears about that, concerns about that really early in the pandemic. By April, we were hearing concerns about this. And for organizations like Community Water Center, and the same holds true with Michael and Leadership Council as well, For us, water is not only a basic human right, but it's a public health necessity. Water is the most basic form of PPE. And so if we're going to have an equitable COVID-19 pandemic recovery, we have to make sure that we keep the water flowing for all of us, not just some of us.
Beautifully put, gentlemen. Thank you. And you bring up a great metaphor, Jonathan. It is really the ultimate PPE. Let's zoom in just a little bit about continued discussion on COVID protections. We've all read about the protections and firewalls, if you will, that have been secured for tenants facing evictions, protections for renters and homeowners facing the shutoff of their utilities. Are those protections in place for water customers in California? Because I know the water utilities can't lower rates or provide financial breaks to some customers in need and then raise the price up for other customers that are not having the same challenge. What do you say to that, Senator?
Yeah, I believe that the governor's executive order did handle that. I'd like to hear from Michael and Jonathan on their thoughts on that. But I believe the executive order did. Prior to that, of course, there was no protection other than certain things that water utilities had to do before they would shut somebody's water off.
Yeah, gentlemen, get your response on that, and also, too, the effect that Prop 218 has had in that discussion and that dynamic. Jonathan?
Sure. Why don't I start just on the executive order, then Mike, maybe you can chime in on the Prop 218 issue. So we do have a statewide water shutoff moratorium in place that was put forward via executive order by Governor Newsom last spring. And that was really important for all the obvious reasons, and it was the right thing to do. And it's something that certainly Community Water Center, as well as Leadership Council, and frankly, many others advocated very strongly for. So that was important to get in place early, this protection to make sure that during a pandemic, we weren't having folks' water being shut off, because of a economic crisis that they did not cause, because of this virus. But the reality has been that those water bills have kept coming in month after month after month. And again, we begin hearing alarm about that really early. What are we going to do about the water bills for, that range in the hundreds of dollars or higher, and no sort of plan for relief? And so that is what led to later on last year, the State Water Board conducting their survey of water debt throughout the state. And as you've already mentioned, there is $1 billion in water debt affecting nearly 5 million Californians. And we know that around 500,000 Californians have over $1,000 each in water debt. And those figures, those are based on survey from last fall. We know that as we went into the beginning of this year, it was estimated that water debt is increasing by $100 million each month. So this issue continues to grow in its severity.
And Michael.
Yeah, touching on a couple things there. The first is that throughout the state, there is no statewide water safety net program that provides subsidies to low-income households to be able to afford water like there is for other utilities like electricity or telecommunications. So that's one thing that really needs to be fixed, and is something we're talking about today. On Proposition 218, unfortunately, it does restrict water systems, public water systems in particular, in the state from offering low-income rate assistance programs that are funded with ratepayer funds. We think that's a problem. And it also points to the need for a statewide program like we're proposing to establish in SB 222. Some of the private water utilities, paradoxically, do have low-income rate assistance programs because they're not restricted by Proposition 218. So that's something that we really want to address to make sure that those served by public water utilities, which is the majority of people throughout the state, more than 80% of people are served by a public water utility, have access to affordability programs.
Yes, Senator.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Michael, does it prohibit water agencies that could fall under the auspices of Proposition 218 from making, let's say, a deal with let's say that at the end of the pandemic, a water user owes $2,500. Could they do an offer in compromise or something of that nature with that person and say, if you pay us $1,000, we'll write off the balance and let's start all over again?
Good question, Senator. So no, water systems throughout the state engage in compromise with customers all the time. They write off bad debt all the time. That's really common, and it's an important distinction between these two bills. There are limitations on using ratepayer funds to establish a low-income rate assistance program, a broader program. But we don't think that restriction restricts water systems' abilities to offer progressive policies like debt forgiveness, as long as it's either using non-ratepayer funds or it's kind of an individual determination, like what you were mentioning, Senator, where there is an issue where there's an inability of a customer to pay debt, it's really bad debt or a write-off, and there is the ability of water systems to compromise with customers to make sure that they are maintaining access to drinking water.
I'll just add that we know about 50% of Californians don't have access to any kind of water affordability program. Those that do have access to a water affordability program, for multiple reasons, may not actually be having their need met adequately. So there really is broad understanding in California that status quo isn't working, and it's just a matter of how do we make thoughtful, common sense improvements to better address this crisis around water affordability. And I think, again, that's where SB 222 and 223 really come in and offer us that opportunity.
I actually, Senator, want to talk a little bit more about your bills. And I'm going to admit something to you candidly here. When I was first preparing for this podcast discussion and looking at these new bills, my initial thought was, wow, these types of water-related bills usually come from your colleagues down in the Central Valley, where the need for and the impact for safe, clean, affordable drinking water is really pronounced. And one doesn't necessarily expect them to be authored by the representative from the verdant valleys of Napa, wine country. But as I got to thinking about it and realizing that you are no stranger to the legislative priority of water, and in fact the needs and challenges of the communities in your Senate district truly mirror those of the districts in the Central Valley, the priority role that water plays in your mutual economies, the essential workers in your fields who are at the mercy of water regulations and the debt, and the agricultural economy in your respective districts, because wine country is ag country. So set me straight, Senator, on my thinking about your water policy creds, particularly in light of these new bills.
Well, as I stated earlier, when I was in the Assembly, I represented Lake County, which is an agricultural community, as well, and it just rang out at me as I was going to town halls and forums. It was like the number one thing a lot of these senior citizens were bringing up to me, and you've got to do something. We've talked about this for ages. This is a big problem. It needs to be fixed.
Right.
And so that was really the genesis. And then also once I did AB 401 at the time, and then started getting these areas and talking to experts that really know their stuff, like Michael and Jonathan and others at the water boards and different advocates, it really casted a net that was far wider than just my district. And after all, we passed bills in the state of California for the state of California. And so while probably the minority of the people in my Senate district have this problem of all the people that have the problem, I know it's widespread, and right. I believe I'm duty-bound to help all those in the state of California that have this problem. I really believe in incrementalism.
Right.
And the state of California is not in a position to put a whole lot of money into a fund that would be established at the Department of Finance, I guess. And it's really important that we get this fund established. We can get nonprofit money in it right now. I think there's about $65 million of federal money that we're going to be getting in. Chump change, really, compared to what we really need. But we need to get it started. We need to get that fund built so that we can, next year, really work in the budget process, try to get some different funding sources, working with advocates. And, there are a number of different funding sources we could possibly do. Now, SB 223 just builds on, my bill from last year, I believe was 998, or was the year before. That bill had all water companies with 200 services or greater that it applied to. Once again, incrementalism. I had problems with the small systems, 200 and less, for obvious reasons. I think there were people that really feared that these smaller water districts would go out of business somehow. But now what we're doing in 223 is not only making sure that they have to adhere to water shutoff standards before they go and shut somebody's water off, but also this bill will help, and that fund also will help them, recover, because it's just as important that we keep the water companies in business as it is that we keep these people's water bills paid.
And your incrementalism, as you describe it, is really important, particularly pushing back against some of the initial concerns of these bills as they were introduced in the new session and here into the new year about which agency will be responsible for administering the water assistance programs and the conflict, if any, with Prop 218. Ultimately, as you say, with the incrementalism, let's just find a way to get the money, let's secure the money, and then we'll deal with the details moving forward, right?
Exactly.
Gentlemen, Jonathan and Michael, do you support Senator Dodd with his incremental approach with this legislation? Jonathan?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to start this, although Mike, feel free to jump in. So what I would say is that thanks to Senator Dodd's leadership, we've made real progress over the last several years, step by step. Again, first with his legislation several years ago, AB 401, that required the State Water Board to create a plan and recommendations to the legislature on a statewide water affordability program. And we now have that. And that is directly led to SB 222. And then with SB 223, we're really building off of this, initial baseline set of protections that were established with SB 998 a couple of years ago. And so what I would say is that for communities that community water centers the privilege of working with, what they need is safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. And it's really on all of us to keep taking steps, but with real urgency, to address that crisis. And we think that this pandemic, if we didn't understand this before, this pandemic has really been a painful reminder, just again, how essential access to safe and affordable drinking water is. So these bills, for us can't come soon enough, but they're also, we think, thoughtful and the right bills to help move us forward as a state.
Michael.
So I think just bringing it back to the importance of these bills to communities we're working with, I'm thinking in particular of Cantua Creek and El Porvenir in Fresno County, which are small farm worker communities and on the west side of Fresno County. In the summer, in both communities, folks are facing $100 plus water bills. And these are low-income communities. So that's really unaffordable for folks. And what that means in Cantua Creek and El Porvenir is that people have a hard time paying those bills. They make difficult trade-offs. And they're also at risk of shutoffs and losing access to water altogether. So SB 222 is really important to make sure that folks can afford their water, especially low-income households throughout the state. And SB 223 is important to make sure that as people fall behind, there's a path to catch back up that doesn't include loss of access to an essential like drinking water.
All right, dealing with some of the ancillary issues regarding water here in California, going back to the whole too cheap and too expensive discussion, our state's water infrastructure was engineered for a 20th century population and you could say a 20th century climate. But the infrastructure that we see here now in 2021 is outdated. It is decaying, the dams, the reservoirs, etc. And then there is the legal and financial infrastructure that's getting old as well, which we have alluded to here, the pricing and the allocation rules. The pandemic has really brought those stresses on the infrastructure, financial and otherwise, into sharp relief. Let's discuss that. Senator, what's your take on that?
Well, even before the pandemic, we had this critical issue. We saw what happened with the dam up in Orville and all the cost that was the state. A lot of that is just preventative maintenance that wasn't done over the years, but some of that is just, at the end of the day, a less than adequate focus on that preventative maintenance. And I think we see that a lot with infrastructure in the state of California, not only our water systems, our utility system, and it's not just the state government. This goes far wider, not only our buildings, our water, our electrical systems, and we just have to do a better job. The other thing, and I'd like a comment from Michael and Jonathan on this, is, look, it's important that we have a Safe Drinking Water Act, that we have a 21st century water systems with clean water, and people aren't going to die from cancer and everything from drinking their water. And we know all over the world that there are problems, with this issue. But at the same time, you have, we could even be to the point where we have overzealous regulations on the quality of our drinking water. And what I'd really like to see is a little bit more focus before we put a new contaminant in and say, this is what you have. Chrome 6 is one example in my district now that water districts, small and large, are having to pay millions of dollars for with really, I don't think really the adequate background that suggests that should be a constituent that, be totally removed from the water. And so nevertheless, what happens when you have that is you have a small water system with 100 people. They have to front that bill. 200 people have to front that bill. So those are something that I think that we need to also work on, and that'll be probably part of my future work in the legislature. And we may be doing it just fine, but it's a question that I have from anecdotal information that's been given to me over the years.
Jonathan and Michael, any comment on that? Jonathan?
So, water is unfortunately a threat. We work in communities like East Orosi in the Central Valley where they haven't had safe water for years. And it's sort of understood that if you're going to have someone over to your home, you better make sure you have enough bottled water. You have to make sure that your little kid doesn't, drink the water out of the hose, because that's the threat that water unfortunately represents in your community. So we have to act with a level of urgency that responds to that public health threat. But we also believe that water can be an opportunity. And to just give one example, we believe that water can be a real engine of equitable economic growth, not only in California, but really across the country. There are drinking water projects in everyone's backyard. And certainly that's the case in California. And we also know we need more funding and more investment for drinking water projects. So as we talk in the state about a climate resilience bond, we believe that water should be a centerpiece of that. As we look to Congress that is putting forward, both COVID emergency relief packages and a pending infrastructure package, we believe again that water can be an engine of equitable economic growth for the communities that have been left behind over these last decades, but in a way that really lifts all boats in all communities.
Well said. Michael?
A couple of things. One is that water rates are up 45% in the state since 2007. Just over a decade, that water rates are almost 50% higher than they used to be. And that presents real affordability challenges that we're trying to address through these bills. At the same time, small water systems have failing infrastructure. I've seen parts held together with duct tape. I work with systems that have pumps for their groundwater well, their only groundwater well, that fail every summer because they are way past when they should have just been retired and replaced. So these are severe infrastructure challenges at the same time as we have an affordability crisis. And I think a couple of things. One is that there is a real need for this social safety net program in SB 222. The other is that for the smallest water systems in the state, many of those are set up, really designed to fail, set up in a way that they can't succeed. They have too few connections, and the infrastructure challenges are too difficult. I'm thinking of Tullyville in Tulare County, which actually struggles with hexavalent chromium, which the senator mentioned. The water system serves only 76 households, and this is a low-income community, so they can't really afford to raise their water rates. In many communities like Tullyville, the solution is to get out of the water business altogether, to consolidate with a nearby water system. And unfortunately, in many cases, the barrier isn't funding to do that or technical feasibility, it's political barriers. So in the case of Tullyville, it's the nearby city of Exeter, which has refused to consolidate for the last 2 decades, despite pressure from Tullyville residents to move in that direction. And there is a need for additional policy tools to solve those political barriers. SB 403 is the bill that Senator Lena Gonzalez is authoring this session that we're sponsoring. And I believe Senator Dodd is a co-author on that bill.
That's right.
That would expand the state water board's tools to address situations like Tooleyville and very small water systems dealing with contamination issues that really also have an affordability challenge.
Well, I think Governor Brown actually had, I don't know if it was an executive order or idea. I don't know if it materialized. Michael or Jonathan probably know, but as part of his, water right for all, had some policy parameters on water districts that can come together, merge. That is really a smart thing because these small water districts all by themselves, it's very, very difficult. So in those cases, I mean, like a community like Exeter, that just makes so much sense that they merge water districts for the betterment of all.
Totally agree. And there's really a benefit to both communities in most consolidations if folks are willing to sit down and actually work it through. The state does have funding available for consolidations, and it's really good policy. It results in a more sustainable system that's often more affordable for the residents served by the system as well.
I would just add the state has set a goal of 200 consolidations just over the next couple of years alone. So this issue is really an opportunity, but also something we need to keep leaning into to make sure that where there are opportunities for consolidation, that those are happening.
So you both have really filled in the blanks there because the obstacle to consolidation is money. Obviously, you got one well-run district, perhaps, that's solvent, another one that's not. The state believes in this policy of equality for all, for safe, affordable drinking water, and are putting their money, we are putting our money where our mouths are and helping fund those consolidations.
Well said, gentlemen. Thank you. Also, I want to talk just briefly, too, about drought, the impact that drought has had on California. We're no stranger to it here in the state, especially impacting ag. And Michael and Jonathan, I know in the districts and communities you work on, this is a profound effect. We saw in the news just this last week that the state is going to be limiting the water allocation to the water districts and their agricultural customers in the valley throughout the state to 5% of their typical water allotment. That's going to lead to a lot of fallow fields and hardship for farmers and farm workers all over the state. Michael and Jonathan, any comment on that from what you see on the ground?
I can start because this is a top priority for Community Water Center, although we're working collaboratively with Leadership Council and many other organizations. But this issue of drought is of real concern for us. So we know that as of today, 85% of the state is in some level of drought conditions. So this is not a future concern. This is now. And we really want to see the state be putting together a proactive drought plan, really an emergency plan, so that we have that ready to go by summer. Because we know based on the last drought that happened back in 2014, 2015, that if we wait to have a proactive plan in place as a state, it's going to be too late. We are also, though, working to put in place a long-term framework around more proactive drought planning in this state, which we don't have. It's really a gap. And we are a drought state, whether we like it or not. And so we are working with Senator Hertzberg, who has introduced SB 552, to put in place a more proactive framework in the state around drought planning. We're really grateful that Senator Dodd, once again, is a co-author on that effort. And the more that we can be having proactive plans in place, the more that we're going to be able to better navigate this real challenge that's not only going to be with us this year, but this is just the reality of California, and it's only going to become more of a reality because of climate change.
I think what what we're seeing now and what our biggest concern is domestic wells and small water systems losing access to drinking water and becoming dewatered as drought conditions persist. We've been seeing that even outside of the drought in places like Madera County around Fairmead, where last fall we were seeing 2 wells a week go dry. That's something that we're very, very concerned about going into this summer as water conditions look dire. And one thing that we probably can't get into in a lot of detail on this podcast, like you said, we can talk about water all day, is effective implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and restrictions on ag pumping during drought conditions so that we protect access to drinking water for especially vulnerable communities and households.
Well, that's right. And, I had a bill that sought to make it more strict for SGMA regulations for communities that really had, and I can't remember the term of art, but were in the extreme problem, areas where they have to have more transparency when they drill wells. And you would have thought that was, the worst thing that I could have ever done for so many of those farmers down there. And I get the fact that they're worried too. But, at the end of the day, it's important that we do have transparency. The fact that these regulations are in place will help. Like anything else, they're not perfection because we don't have control over climate change. And this is, in my view, these issues are a direct result. And, in my district and throughout the state of California, we can't finish this podcast without talking about wildfires and water. Because at the same time, drought's a part of climate change, but it's also been part of the landscape, let's face it, in the state of California for a long time. But you have this drought, now all of a sudden, all this fuel that you have in the forest becomes a tinderbox. Right. And it's really, really critical. And then because of climate change, we'll have atmospheric rivers and more rain than we know what to do with, and it just further exacerbates the situation. But I'll tell you, I feel for the administration. I feel for this governor, who I support wholeheartedly. Here's another issue that's on the governor's plate that is not of his making.
Yes.
And so, anything we can do to advance legislation, policy that really helps us move forward and with our water in the state of California, it's just really critical.
Just as a final thought as we wrap here, gentlemen, this moment in time of pandemic disruption that we have seen for this last year, for all of the chaos and the heartbreak and the hardship it has caused, has created actually a new opportunity to rework our inadequate and inequitable infrastructure, sociological, political, resourceful, our water systems included, and reconceive how we value and manage them. And I know, Jonathan, you've touched on this just a few moments ago yourself. We can bend the arc toward the structural change that we need. Senator, your bills are going to help. Organizations like Michael's and Jonathan's will ally with you to help ensure that water is reliable and affordable to everybody, close the water access gaps, and reduce the debt. But looking back at the big picture and back to the water is a relative metaphor that I talked about in regards to indigenous communities, can we take care fully in the way we need to with this family member that we call water?
Yeah, this is Michael. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Brian, that we have an opportunity now to reflect on how we did things before the pandemic and the inequities that resulted in terms of access to water, in terms of access to safe wastewater infrastructure, in terms of, like was mentioned briefly on this podcast, rental assistance and making sure that people have access to a quality, affordable housing. I think this is an opportunity to look at how we did things before and try to improve coming out of the pandemic and make sure that all Californians have access to safe and affordable drinking water and basic necessities like housing. I think it's an opportunity that we can't afford to miss. And I have a lot of optimism because of policy efforts like SB 222, 223, that we aren't going to miss that opportunity, that we are going to provide a more equitable future for Californians.
This is Jonathan. I'll just add to that by saying that, again, access to safe drinking water is a basic human right that's recognized in California. And in a pandemic, access to water is the most basic form of PPE. And that if we're going to have an equitable COVID recovery, we have to make sure that we keep the water flowing. SB 222 and SB 223 will help us do that. These are really thoughtful bills, and the time is right to see them to the finish line. So we are grateful to Senator Dodd for his continued leadership on this issue, and we look forward to supporting him on this important legislation.
Senator Dodd, I'll give you the parting comments here. Can we take care of this family member that we call water? Can we make all of this happen?
We can. But just like I said, I'm a great believer in incrementalism. And a lot of times, individual bills, when you do it this way, are not the silver bullet all by themselves. But over time, a patchwork quilt, if you will, of bills all working together that have funding, that have policy, that have study, all attached to them, give us the information and perhaps the resources to get things done. So incrementally, this is something we're better off, and we'll be better off at the end of this year than we were last year. You use that family member analogy. I would say the same thing, about families, that have water debt or that have any kind of debt. They can't take care of it overnight. And let's face it, the state of California is not going to be able to take care of all these problems overnight, but incrementally, by advancing policy, by advancing money, and helping people that need the help most is really going to help. And yes, we're going to get there, no matter how long it takes.
Gentlemen, we barely scratched the surface even after an hour of discussion, but I thank you so much for being part of this conversation here on this podcast, for even educating me further on the solutions to water debt and inequity. Michael Claiborne from the Leadership Council and Jonathan Nelson with the Community Water Center, thank you both for your fearless and tireless advocacy on behalf of your communities when it comes to water and other vital human resources. I wish you both, you and your families and your clients, safety and peace of mind. Thanks for being with us on Then There's California.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Senator Dodd, as always, great to see you, my friend. You're always welcome to come join us and talk about these issues. Thanks for being with us, and I wish you the best for this legislative year.
Well, Brian, thanks a lot for having me on, and also thanks to Michael and Jonathan for their great help. Appreciate it.
And thank you, Senator Dodd, for the work on these bills. They will make a difference, so thank you.
Right on. Thanks, guys.
And that brings a close to this edition of Then There's California. We're proud to have technical and production assistance and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, Gunchan Patel, John Roman, McClenna Woods, Blake Hooper, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of Senator Bill Dodd, representing the 3rd State Senate District in Northern California, along with Michael Claiborne, the directing attorney with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and Jonathan Nelson, policy director for the Community Water Center, I'm Brian Green at the state capitol here in Sacramento. Thanks for listening, everybody, to Then There's California.